Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money show. I'm sitting down today with my friend and fellow Bitcoin author, Brandon Quittem. Brandon is the head of comms at Swan Bitcoin. And as I mentioned, also a very well-known author, specifically in this at this juncture of kind of like Bitcoin meets complexity meets biology. You've written some good stuff. And today we're going to be talking about your latest piece. Bitcoin is a pioneer species. So Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Robert. I've been looking forward to this. We've got a long history and had a lot of good chats, so I'm excited to record one today.
Yeah, man, it's great to see you again. I still reflect back on our early conversations. I think we were in Erewhon in Los Angeles. You visited at one point. It was the first time we met. And yeah, we just immediately hit it off, going down all these rabbit holes related to Bitcoin. That was in 2017, right?
I think it was 2018.
Or 2018. Okay.
Yeah. You mind if I tell an embarrassing story about that?
Please.
So I'm going out to LA. I live in Minneapolis, and I just tweeted the standard, "Hey, Twitter, I'm going to LA. What Bitcoiners want to meet up?" And this relatively unknown meathead DM'd me named Robert, and he said he read my recent mycelium piece and he wanted to get together. I'm like, all right, who's this guy? Don't know who he is. Let's get together. Okay, we go to the grocery store. We have some smoothies, and it turns into a 3-4 hour conversation that completely blew my mind. And I was like, wow, is that brother from another mother? What just happened? And yeah, a year later or something like that. I mean, Breedlove's a household name at this point, so a lot low on that one.
Yeah, and we were looking very LA, I think, with our matching man buns and the super overpriced grocery store.
Exactly.
Broing out on a Bitcoin conversation. So that was great.
Exactly.
Good times. Well, on this topic of Bitcoin as a pioneer species, you really hit the map, I guess, originally with mycelium of money. And I just love thinking about Bitcoin through a biological lens, because almost like economics, where it seems like biology is another science that we're very young in. We're barely starting to understand biology at a really deep level. Kind of like we're just starting to realize that Keynesian economics is BS, right? And we're getting back to the roots of Austrian economics, which is another young science. You know, we only realized value is subjective less than 200 years ago. So I guess my question would be, where's the proper place to start in exploring Bitcoin as a pioneer species?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think just to touch on biology really quickly, I think that's a profound point. And you don't need to look any further than our food pyramid, right? It's very clear that we don't even know what's appropriate for a human to eat. If you look back every 100 years for the last, let's say 500, our scientific consensus at the time is incredibly embarrassing with what we know today. And I think it would also be pretty arrogant to assume that our current understanding of biology is complete or even accurate. And so, yeah, I think biology fits squarely in the way too complex, nearly impossible for us to predict. And so we do our best to zoom in with a microscope, and we do our best to observe systems. But I think we need a little bit of humility when we approach the subject, in the same way that we need a little bit of humility when we approach economics, which is, as we were talking pre-show, is a complex system. It cannot be reduced down to pretty equations, and it cannot be steered. It cannot be managed with any level of accuracy. And so I think just a foundation of complexity is important, right? Small changes introduced into a complex system have outsized impacts. There's constantly unintended consequences from what seemingly are simple policy decisions, right? You can look through history for endless examples here. And so to start this essay, I think just knowing that I'm trying to approach Bitcoin again as a living organism, which is my favorite approach, but this time it's looking at incentives specifically in the mining industry. And I think the mining aspect of Bitcoin is now the most interesting part. But early on in my Bitcoin journey, I sort of dismissed it as a service provider, right? A time stamping service rather than its own ecosystem. And so, yeah, I think starting there, and the other side to frame this up is that most people now understand Bitcoin as universal global property rights, which that alone will dramatically change the world. But in this piece, I argue that Bitcoin mining is sort of a incentive structure to improve our ability to harness energy. So it's kind of a forcing function to teach humans how to master energy. And if that's true, there couldn't be anything more important than that for our species, because energy is pretty much a prerequisite for all the good things we do, right? If you're a humanitarian and you want to improve the world, the single number one thing you can do is make energy more accessible or cheaper.
Right.
Or as Jordan Peterson recently said, make everyone wealthy. And I would say that energy is upstream of wealth. And so that's just like property rights. I think access to energy is sort of a foundational thing, a foundational prerequisite for human flourishing.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I like this idea of energy as kind of the through line too, between all these different domains. Like clearly biological systems are using energy. They're basically strategies, executing in an environment trying to establish fitness, but they consume energy to do that, to execute and propagate the strategy. So, in an economic sense, wealth, I don't want to say wealth is energy, but you can't have wealth without energy. Like energy is the number one input, the primary input to every market process at even a biological level, which clearly expands upward into a social level. So how we relate to energy and how efficiently we harness it, that is the name of the game, right? Like in a Darwinian sense, at a civilizational sense, it's the whole thing.
Yeah, 100%. If we want to go back through history for a second and just talk about how energy fits in, right? We go, let's say 3 billion years ago to the oxygen revolution. This is the first organisms that learned how to harness energy from the sun, right? So the very first tiny little cells, cyanobacteria, could photosynthesize. And okay, great. They turn themselves from the solar panels and convert that energy from the sun, and they exhale oxygen. Right. So it starts right there. Okay, great. Oxygen now fills our atmosphere, which makes way for all complex life afterwards. So fast forward a billion years, we have the eukaryotes, complex life. The leading theory, as I understand it, is two little cells right next to each other. One cell absorbs the cell next to them with a flexible membrane. Endosymbiosis is that theory. And now you have two cells kind of merged together, and they were allowed to outcompete, or they were able to outcompete. And what essentially came out of that is mitochondria, right? You absorb this formerly bacterial cell. Now it's part of all eukaryotes, the power plant of the cell, if you remember 8th grade biology. And there you go. So now we have the Cambrian explosion, life takes off. Skipping a few steps, now we have Homo sapiens, right? We learn how to use fire. We learn how to burn wood. That's biomass. We're unleashing energy trapped in that dense carbon stores. Again, suns, plants, wood, burn it, release energy. Then we're domesticating animals. That's just a better way to harness their energy to plow, right? Increased our carrying capacity as a species, right? Each step, increase energy, increase carrying capacity. Okay, we get to the Industrial Revolution. We harness fossil fuels. Our tools get even better. What does that do? We can do more with less. So we have more time for leisure. Fewer people are required to produce food. We get more specialized. Commerce explodes, wealth explodes. What else happens? We more or less get rid of poverty relatively. Obviously, we have a long way to go. But each step, increase carrying capacity, increase wealth. And it's all about energy every step of the way.
Yeah. What is it? The Kardashev scale? Is that what it's called? Where you basically can quantify the sophistication of a civilization by how much energy it's harnessing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think we're a Kardashev 0 scale right now. And I think 1, I'm not an expert here, but I think scale 1 is if we harness enough energy that hits our planet.
from the
And
sun.
so,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, we're like 0.01, not even probably 0.01% on our way to one.
Yeah. And what's funny here is wealth has such a stigma in today's fiat culture. It's like to think of someone as wealthy. I think the traditional mindset is like somehow someone being wealthy is like detracting from you. Like if you're not wealthy and someone else is wealthy, it's like they've taken advantage of you somehow. When in fact it couldn't be the opposite. It couldn't be further from the truth, because it is the roundaboutness of our production processes, our interdependence, basically through trade relationships, that's creating all of this wealth. And to your point, as we've progressed, in terms of how well we can harness resources and deploy them into trade networks, we've all become more wealthy, to the point where the least wealthy person today is in some ways more wealthy than, say, the richest person in the world, even just a few hundred years ago, in terms of access to certain medical technology or transportation, things like that. So yeah, it's all an energy game.
Yeah, and a couple of interesting points there with regards to demonizing wealth, right? And I think one thing to consider here is that humans, it's not about our absolute wealth, it's about our relative wealth, right? Baked into our biology is what is our neighbor doing? We got to outcompete our neighbor, we got to outreduce our neighbor. And so, yeah, today we have the let's say the classic left-leaning American barista archetype that sort of gets punched around on the internet. They're wealthy. 200 years ago, the king didn't have a fraction of their wealth, and yet they're complaining from their MacBook about the wealthy people taking from them, right? It's kind of a funny framing. But I think to diagnose what's happening today is it's not a new story. What's happening is that our economic system is not distributing wealth very fairly to the bottom half. So young people or poor people look around and they say, well, it's not working, so we must blame capitalism, or we must blame the evil billionaires who are hoarding all the wealth and paying all the little people too little just so they can sit in a mountain of gold, right? And I think that's actually just a form of scapegoating. To your previous point, wealth is created through trade. There was no wealth, right? Jeff Bezos employs a lot of people, built a lot of wealth, and created a lot of value. And so there would be no wealth for him to hoard if he didn't create an insane amount of value for 3 decades.
Right.
And that seems to get missed. And okay, it's okay to have people miss the point, but where I find it risky or dangerous, or I see it coming to a head, is that it's going to continue getting worse. And then what happens? The masses are willing to go to great lengths, and essentially the politicians will harness that populist feeling and use it to do their bidding, or use it to increase marginal tax rate up to the 60 and 70% range, which is what happened in the 1930s. Same deal. Young people had the slogan of "Eat the rich." Young people turned to socialism.
Right.
Today, unironically, young people are turning to socialism again because they diagnosed a problem. They just don't understand it well enough. So they made hasty conclusions that just so happen to be misinformed.
Yeah, it's very disenchanting to see it happening again. And I would identify it as misplaced blame. Right? They're blaming entrepreneurs for the wealth that's actually being confiscated from them by the state. And so, when you get a handle on economics, it's almost intuitive. It's like an entrepreneur can only become wealthy in an actual free market where property rights are strong by satisfying the wants of consumers, right? Like if there's something people want, people will sacrifice for it by buying it, right? They'll go to work, earn, and buy the thing. Whereas, so a Bezos in that situation, as you described, he had to create a ton of value to become wealthy. He satisfied the wants of market actors to himself become wealthy. So that's great. We want all that all the time, everywhere. What you don't want is the statist approach to wealth accumulation, where they're taxing and inflating, they're stealing from people, which is clearly very dissatisfactory. But it's amazing to me that people don't understand that. You're describing the stereotypical barista left-leaning person. All of the things they're complaining about are caused by the state, but they're pointing it at Jeff Bezos. I think it's just an ignorance of economic or energetic reality, even.
Absolutely. And I think I think what else is another theme that's kind of merging with that is this idea that we're destroying the planet and that we need to consume less. There needs to be less people. We need to stop eating meat. We need to essentially turn around the innovation ship and retreat. And I just am so fundamentally against this idea. It's such a pessimistic approach. And I think humans are much more creative and much more innovative and much more willing to perform, given a game that feels fair, right? And I think humans are at their best striving for big goals, not retreating and pinching pennies, right? You can either like manage your budget better and spend less, or you can go out there and produce more income and figure out what you're good at and multiply, leverage your skills. And I think that sort of tension, it's like, are we going to be an abundant society or are we going to be a society of scarcity? Right? Scarcity, regulate, constrain everything, have fewer kids, or abundance. Let's focus on doing the things that we're able to do in 10x, 100x our energy, right? If we look to future problems, okay, people say we're going to have wars over fresh water. Okay, potentially true. Well, if we 100x our energy capacity, we can just desalinate the oceans.
Right.
Problem solved. Right. I think I'd rather live in that world. It's not like we don't have enough space. We can be a lot smarter with what we have. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent point. That tech already exists, right? Desalination. And I've also, in my conversation with Booth, he was making the point that carbon filtration exists too, where we can filter carbon out of the air. It is only a matter of having cheaper energy. So if we can just, focus all of the human ingenuity at this problem of making energy cheaper or energy sources more economical, which, as I think we're going to get into, Bitcoin mining is a huge step in that direction. You're solving one of the most upstream, if not the most upstream problem in economics, which is the cost of the primary input, which is energy itself.
Exactly. That's like the master commodity, right? Before you do anything, before you go acquire another commodity, you need energy and a lot of it. And to Bitcoin mining, I like the phrase where Bitcoin mining is everything you don't understand about energy compared with everything you don't understand about Bitcoin. And I think that sort of frames up the war we're seeing on Twitter. We're seeing the White House saying nonsense. Politicians are saying embarrassing things. Hopefully they realize that eventually. We're seeing proof of work FUD ramp up, energy FUD ramp up. And so that's kind of the purpose of this paper, is to really pitch energy as a net positive for humanity and pitch Bitcoin as a way to help us achieve that. And then, okay, fine. Let's say Bitcoin does help us achieve energy mastery. What kind of speculations can we have about the long-term value of that? Right. It's still very early. And I think I want to use less technical jargon and more paint the story so people can see this as a good thing, right? And there's so many misunderstandings about energy, and that, again, misunderstandings okay, except for in this situation, it leads to poor policy choices, right? In Germany, they got rid of all their nuclear plants. Okay, what's the net result? Some greenies got to feel good about themselves, and energy price went up 5 to 10x in the last decade. And 50% of their energy is reliant on Russia. Okay, so it's a horrible geopolitical strategy. Their people are suffering, and it was all self-inflicted due to a misunderstanding of energy. And the average person, or I don't know how the decision was actually made, but point being, this stuff matters. And so humans need to understand what we're doing here and realize that nuclear is good. Wind and solar cannot save us. They're only supplemental energy sources because they're not consistent, right? There's all these things. And oh man, I could go forever on that. Like, how about GDP per capita? Directly correlated to energy consumption. It's a straight line, highly correlated. So if you care about help raising people out of poverty, there you go, energy. It's not attacking Bitcoin for being a crypto bro tool. Yeah. It's the most humanitarian invention in the history of time. And the left seems to not be able to grapple with that. And I guess I don't blame them. There's a long road to this level of understanding.
there seems to be a conflation with energy use and pollution. Like maybe the statist mentality on this is like they think they're the same thing. It's like we need to reduce energy consumption as if that means reduce pollution, but they're not at all the same thing, clearly. Is that the source of these bad ideas? Or like how is this bullshit getting stuck in our political discourse?
Good question. I think what I observe, and I don't have any confidence really in this domain, but I observe carbon credits as our attempt to quantify the climate problem. And so then what people will say is they measure Bitcoin mining as a carbon output, right? And so I think that correlation is embedded in everyone's head. And so what they think about is every energy source wastes carbon. That's the only thing I can think of, right? It has to be like reduced down, carbon bad, Bitcoin makes carbon. I think it's honestly at that level of discourse, because you push the people who attack Bitcoin's energy stuff, and I don't know the percentage, but high 90%, they don't have any clue what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so they're just sort of repeating their ideological talking points that their tribe handed them. But again, they're shooting themselves in the foot. And so ignorance is evil. I guess that's the outcome of that.
And it's admittedly a complex enough domain that it's hard, right? It takes a little bit of work to actually get your head around it. How do you go into this topic if you're trying to package it simply? Do you have like an intro or some easy packaging for people to warm up to this idea of energy consumption does not equal ecological cataclysm?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say I have a great talking point there. I would just go on the opposite end and just say, without energy, you can't heat your house, cool your house, produce food, move around, build things. And so for example, Alex Epstein's argument, the moral case for fossil fuels, right? In the last 200 years, what did we do? We got rid of almost all the climate related deaths in our species. Most of them come from inadequate heating or cooling at the wrong time of year, and also lack of food, right? If you want to produce food in our admittedly poor way of industrial farming, you need a lot of fertilizer, and fertilizer only comes from fossil fuels. We don't have a way around it. And so I guess I wouldn't try to minimize the pollution side. I would just focus on the upside. But I think your point is valid, where dropping bad chemicals in the ocean is not the same thing as consuming nuclear energy. Right. And I think that is important, where people think more energy consumed is bad. And I think we totally have to flip that on its head. More energy is good. Yes. Period.
Yeah. I mean, there's something, it's so fundamental. It's almost hard to put into words, but it's like everything that's moving is channeling energy. So if you want to move, if you want to be free in the world, right? Maybe say energy harnessing or consumption is proportionate to our degrees of freedom. Because if you're just a caveman, the only energy you can channel is kind of your bodily energy. You're not going to be flying around the world or having a nice cabin or, eating grass-fed beef. I mean, maybe they eat some beef, but they're not going to have a cattle ranch and all this. So, yeah, we need a way to flip the script, I guess, in people's mind about energy, because it really seems to be one directional. Like there's this typical refrain against Bitcoin, like, oh, it uses so much energy. And that just seems like it's embedded in that phrase is like all this stuff about pollution and wastefulness and hurting the environment. And it's a tough one to debunk.
It is. And sadly, I don't think we're going to move the herd's understanding on this one. I think the reality is entrepreneurs are going to go to work and the results are going to speak for themselves. And if the masses are incapable of coming to this level of nuance, which is my base case, then great. Then we just need the entrepreneurs and the Bitcoin miners and the communities that benefit positively from this force to speak up. And hopefully that's enough to prevent any heavy-handed regulation. Right. And specifically in the US, okay, the central government is very much on big climate or the ESG approach. And rather than go down that, I think the shining light here is that the US is a federalist based system. And so we'll have California and New York demonize Bitcoin mining. You'll have Wyoming and Texas raise their hand. And I think that's okay, right? I think that's enough for Bitcoin to be sufficiently decentralized and for, honestly, the miners to go where they're treated best.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a key point here is most people don't realize that kicking miners out of China means they leave a politically unstable home, and those refugee miners find a long-term political home.
Right.
And what happens then? Okay, fine. They go to the US and they get tax incentives. The mayor is shaking hands, you're employing people. And then what happens? Those miners aren't going anywhere. They're entrenched, and they just converted a local community into allies. Right. There's an example of Compute North. It's a mining company in Minnesota where I live, and they have a facility in Kearney, Nebraska. And essentially, I think it was either Google or Amazon was going to put a data center there. And then at the last minute, Iowa offered a better deal, and Kearney, Nebraska got rug pulled. So they built this giant energy facility, and there's no customers, right? Pretty small town. So Compute North shows up, they build out this large facility, and they're buying a tremendous amount of their energy behind the meter, right, before it even goes to the grid, and they're mining Bitcoin with it. Okay, what's the net effect of that? Well, now they employ 12 people or something like that in Kearney. The energy production or the energy prices have declined for all the end consumers, right, because the miner increases the economics, and the city loves them. So if the federal government comes down on Kearney, Nebraska, you're going to have a lot of people saying, hey, you're going to raise our energy bill. Hey, you're going to fire our people. Hey, you're going to cause a lot of problems here. Knock it off. And I think that's really the only way we fight this. At least that's how I feel. I hope I'm wrong.
No, that's a great way to look at it, because this idea of bootstrapping economies or giving economies some skin in the game once Bitcoin's there, right? But people have enjoyed the benefits of Bitcoin mining being local to their economy. And it's hard for governments, at least in the Western world, to take away things from people that people really like. You know, we saw the Uber example has been beaten to death on this, but it's like you give people this more efficient system of ride sharing and transportation, and it gets, despite the regulatory resistance, it tends to overcome, because you get this democratic effect of people just using what's best for them. And that sort of pushes up onto policy.
Yeah, great. I think the Uber analogy is honestly a great point, right? Bitcoin miners they are symbiotic with energy producers. It is a net benefit. And as of today, Bitcoin miners are entirely unique. There is no other energy buyer that has this bouquet of traits. And so back to ecology, it's a novel market entrance point, small little change, little disturbance. And I'm predicting gigantic outsized effects for this. Let's jump into this a little bit. Like unique traits. Okay. Number one, co-location, meaning Bitcoin miners go directly to the energy source. That's profound, because traditionally, wherever the energy is being produced, you don't necessarily have the demand next door. Oftentimes, you have to build very expensive high voltage transmission lines and move the energy miles away, which takes years and a lot of capital just to deliver your energy. Rather, Bitcoin miners show up on site, they're mining pretty quickly. Next one, interruptible load demand, meaning, okay, let's say you have a steady production, but steady supply of energy, but your demand fluctuates, right? During the day, demand goes down. Everybody's at work from like 5 to 9, 5 to 10, demand skyrockets. Everyone's at home cooking, watching TV. Okay. The Bitcoin miners, they're buying all that excess energy during the day. And let's say there's a period where energy is constrained and the consumer needs it. Great. Bitcoin miners turn off, right? So they're interruptible load demand or flexible load demand. And what's the next one? High mobility. So they can very quickly move on to the next spot. So as if, let's say Kearney, Nebraska, right? They have excess energy today. Bitcoin miners buy most of it. What if Kearney, Nebraska triples its size and it brings in all this manufacturing to take advantage of that energy? Well, Bitcoin miners get priced out. And so if it was a aluminum smelting plant, which is the historical use for excess energy, that's a lot of wasted capital because you can't just pick up an aluminum smelting factory and move it. Whereas the Bitcoin miners, you just put them in a truck and put them somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so those are the three main traits. What's the effect of this? Well, miners improve the economics of the energy producers. They provide jobs and they increase grid resilience. Right? Bitcoin essentially monetizes energy that no one else would buy. And over the long term, it's my belief that the energy utilities or energy producers who partner with Bitcoin are actually going to outcompete the energy utilities who don't. Right? Because they have better economics. And if they start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet, that could cascade. In exchange, Bitcoin miners get the cheap energy, right? They're seeking cheap energy for higher profits. And they gain the powerful local allies, the local governments and people like we just mentioned. And so they're the buyer of first resort. So that's that net new energy asset where nobody's there to buy it. That's the pioneer species, which we'll get into. And then they're the buyer of last resort, which is we produced excess and no one will buy it. So here comes Bitcoin miners. And so my essay is essentially building on the Bitcoin buyer, the buyer of first resort, or sorry, the buyer of first resort. So a net new energy asset. That's the pioneer species. Probably stop there.
So the first resort you're describing, is this where we get into the bootstrapping of a local economy, right? Whether I think the example you gave offline was like trying to build a dam, but it's not going to be producing electricity until a certain point, and you can mine Bitcoin in the interim to help finance that project. Is that how that works?
Yeah, let's break it down. So that was the first order effects. Second order effects, there's two of them. One is making existing energy assets more efficient. That's like plugging into flared gas or stabilizing a grid with renewables. A lot of people are talking about that. The second one I'm trying to underline here is investing into making it more economical to invest in net new energy assets. And so, for the river example, you have a river. Okay, great. We can build a hydro facility there in this remote mountainous region. Now we have low cost green energy. However, not a lot of people live in remote mountainous regions. And so you're producing energy right away. And so, okay, what would you do? Well, let's say there's a city nearby. Great. You're going to spend a few years building those high voltage transmission lines. And it might take you 2-3 years after you build the energy facility before your source of demand is even online. And in that interim, what happens? You're just burning money. Alternatively, you plug in Bitcoin miners and they're happy to buy every single watt you produce at a fair price, right? And it's marginal revenue for the producer, and the Bitcoin miners are more than happy to take it off their hands. So it essentially decreases cost of capital to invest in energy assets, right? Increases the ROI of energy assets. And that's going to create all kinds of things, right? Speaking of bootstrapping an economy.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So the idea of Bitcoin mining basically decreasing the average cost of capital for some of these large projects. The other thing that's really interesting to me here is that your distribution costs effectively go to zero because the Bitcoin mining is just on premise, right? Whereas instead of needing to build this huge infrastructure to distribute the power out and sell it to demand or get it to demand to sell it, you literally just drop the container right there, right? Whatever the box or trailer, whatever the modular setup is. And there's no distribution because the energy is consumed right there. It's consumed right there in the process of Bitcoin mining. And then it's converted into this hyper portable, unstoppable money, which has a ton of advantages in and of itself. Exactly. And it's logical, by the way, if energy producers that add Bitcoin mining are just going to generate more revenue flat out. So of course they're going to outcompete those that do not. And so you can only imagine the network effect behind that.
Exactly. Then you get into the question of, is energy production and Bitcoin mining going to merge? Right? Are we going to have fully vertically integrated stacks here where energy producers also, okay, what about like Intel in the US? This is speculation. Intel is going to make a chip, right? Okay, if that happens, now they're into building ASICs. Why don't they buy some nuclear plants? Why don't they mine energy or mine Bitcoin with their own hardware on their own energy facilities while attracting these startup cities? Right.
Wow. Yeah.
It starts to get really wacky if we master energy, and we're also able to spread out, which we should probably save that for later. But again, the incentives go really weird places.
Yeah. And then the other piece of that is you layer on some financial services on top of that. So you're like energy producer, meet Bitcoin miner, meet bank, like all in one. There's something really profound about the direct monetization of energy that transforms these traditional divisions we have between industries. Like it almost pulls them into one, at least to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we explain the pioneer species, the actual analogy, to paint the picture? So the pioneer species is a unique species in biology. There's many different types, but it performs a specific role in our ecosystems. And so the famous example is an island off of Iceland, a volcanic island erupts. And that eruption essentially kills all life on the island. So it's just a desolate rock. And then the question is it destined to be a desolate rock forever? And the answer is no. There is unique species that are designed to come colonize that inhospitable landscape. And so these are usually hardy plants and or lichens, which is a fungus plant symbiosis, and they don't really need soil. And so these things either get dropped in a bird poops with the seed and drops into this place, or maybe it washes in shore or goes in the wind, something like that. So it just gets lucky and lands on a desolate landscape. Okay, then this new species, so the pioneer species, enjoys competition-free environment. They produce their own food through photosynthesis. And if they're successful, they essentially bootstrap an entire new ecosystem from a desolate rock. And so think they turn igneous volcanic rock into soil. Now you have a little bit of soil. So now you can have these really hardy plants that kind of like wedge themselves in the cracks. And then fast forward another few decades, now you have these mature forests, mature ecosystems. And they were only possible due to the pioneer species and then the intermediate species, right? It's a process of succession. And then at the end of this process, in the mature ecosystem, actually the pioneer species are no longer able to compete in a resource-rich environment. So they get kicked out and they hopefully reproduce and colonize a new barren rock somewhere else. And so you can think of them like their goal is just to reboot ecosystems after a forest fire, after a landslide, after a volcanic thing, after a meteor. They're very, very crucial. And now obviously the parallel here, which is probably obvious, is Bitcoin miners are the pioneer species. They go find unused energy assets around the world and they help bootstrap an energy asset wherever it is. And okay, now you're producing energy at a low cost. That's going to attract industrial use cases. There's always a use for more energy. So someone's going to come buy it. Okay, great. Now you have an industry boom town. Well, if you have manufacturing jobs, you need labor, you need people there. You also need services to make the people happy, right? It's getting more complex. And over time, now you have a fully flourishing human oasis. And again, fertile conditions, Bitcoin miners can't compete, right? Because end user consumers will always pay more for energy relative to Bitcoin miners. So the Bitcoin miners get priced out and hopefully remember they're mobile, they're going to go find a new energy asset to bootstrap and the process continues.
Wow. That's crazy to think about it that way. Let me ask you this. What are the qualitative differences between the pioneer species versus getting into the intermediate and climax species? I assume the pioneer species is much more hardy or tough because it's living in a really rough environment, whereas maybe the climax species is just less so?
Yeah, that's a big one. One is drought tolerant, right? So think of very hardy species. They don't need a lot of water. And the classic example is a lichen. And a lichen is a symbiosis of at least two organisms, a plant and a fungi. And the plant is just solar panels, right? They're producing food from the sun's energy. And then the fungus is a one cell wall series of tubes, right? This like little underground roots, you can say. And they use chemistry to digest their environment externally. So they use chemistry to turn that igneous rock into its base elements, right? Essentially mining minerals. Wow. And it's digging little tunnels to liberate phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, et cetera, which the plant also needs, right? In exchange for an anchor, right? The roots keep the photosynthesizing plants attached to this rock, and they kind of trade resources. And over time, it converts the rock into soil. And a little bit, let's say giant trees, they could never live in this environment. They need rich soils with complex microbiology and all these other things. And they essentially will shade out this like sort of scraggly little thing that's like flat on the rock. And so eventually they just don't have a chance, right? Intermediate species would be like a little shrubby bush thing that's not very impressive by plant standards. But again, it continues that process of converting rock to soil in more complex ways.
So cool. So I just am imagining some type of parallel here where for human civilization in a way, right? Like initially, to have any form of human civilization in the beginning had to be very hardy. You had to build your walls and have your weapons and all that. But as we've become more wealthy and more sophisticated as a society, we now have a lot more wealth and diversity and all of these things. But those new models of civilization obviously priced out or outcompeted the older ones. So there seems to be this very interesting progression with. I mean, maybe we could quantify this as to like the density of exchange or the intensity of exchange, perhaps, whereas those pioneer species aren't doing a lot. They're just kind of turning sun energy into this digesting of the rock. Whereas if you fast forward to a forest, like there's a lot more exchange occurring at a lot more levels.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what most people don't understand is that a forest is not a bunch of trees next to each other. A forest is an insanely back to how complex biology is. A forest is incalculably complex, and we're just barely scratching the surface here. I had some conversations with an evolutionary biologist, Toby Kears, who studies fungal economies. And she essentially looks underground, and what she observes is that plants and fungi have a complex economy. They trade resources, they perform economic calculations, they buy low, they sell high, they hoard resources and ship them over to where they're scarce so they can get a higher price. And they use each other, they compete, it looks like they lie, steat, and chill to get ahead. And so the reality is, yes, we started with a pioneer species, which is like humans going westward and just barely getting by. It's like dudes and pickaxes, and then the brothels and the bars show up, and then eventually it becomes a town and someone sells them jeans or whatever. And then it can become San Francisco, where instead of like this renegade, steal and like kind of lawless town, it becomes a town where we trade instead of battle, or trade instead of suffer in that same way. And exactly the same on the pioneer species analogy, right? The complex system, they trade, it's 1 + 1 = 3. And it's a cascading effect because they all fit into the ecosystem.
So interesting, that relationship between just how much exchange is occurring and how much wealth is being produced, wealth in the economic sense, but also just wealth in the sense of biomass in the forest, right? It's bootstrapping the intensity of exchange, which is just creating more. I guess ultimately the forest is harnessing a lot more energy, just like we said about civilization, right? The forest is harnessing and channeling a ton more energy than the pioneered landscape. In the same way, the wild, wild west is using way less energy than San Francisco today.
Yeah, exactly. It's all back to energy.
Yeah.
And so from this angle, I guess just one more detour on ecology to your previous point. It's all about energy, right? So the primary producers, ecology creates a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid are plants. Plants harness energy from the sun. So you need a lot of plants because that's harnessing a lot of base energy. More plants equals okay, now you have the ability to have herbivores.
Mhm.
Now you have some creatures that eat the plants. Great. And you need quite a few of those in order to sustain predators who eat the herbivores, right? And so you can only, and then you have apex predators, the bald eagle, the human, the wolf, various other ones. And you can only have those apex predators if every stage below them in the pyramid is robust. And so we need that complex plant system, right? It's all energy constrained. And so you can look at a desert versus the jungle, a rainforest, right? A desert has a lot of sun, but it doesn't have a lot of water. And so you can only have a limited amount of plants. And that is your baseline, right? A limited number of plants means you can't really have many animals. That's why you go to the desert and it sort of feels like it's not alive. Whereas you go to the jungle and there's infinite organisms nearby and you hear them constantly. They walk into your house. They're on your arm when you don't want them to. They're everywhere.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's just interesting. I like a useful way to think about civilization because you can see the consequences of it directly in nature, right? It's like if there's not enough exchange occurring, then you're going to live in poverty, as you can see here in the desert. Versus if we do figure out how to scale a lot of exchange, then you create a lot more wealth and you support a lot more carrying capacity of life, as you described earlier, which is like more like the jungle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the framing I want people to take away is that Bitcoin miners are citadel seeds, right? They just go plant little Bitcoin citadels that, okay, it's unassuming today, but if we fast forward 10, 20, 50, 100 years, that's probably where, at least I'm predicting, that's where the next centers of excellence will be. Right? Like we had the Industrial Revolution, whoever had the most capital, most army, most machines owned the world. Then we have like some new countries like Singapore or Hong Kong or something. They got to take the lessons of the Industrial Revolution and sort of apply them to a modern sense. And if we look forward, I think these little mining citadels, these little bootstrapped ecosystems, I think those are going to attract the type of people that went westward, the pioneer type people. They're going to attract the ideologically aligned people to move out and necessarily spread out for the first time. And what's that going to do? You're going to have high production people living in density, and they're kind of like little startup cities. Yeah. And I think in the future, wealth, well, it already is, but increasingly so, wealth is ideas. Wealth is intangible. And so it's not actually better to have a bigger place, right? You need the natural resources you need, but wealth comes from your brain. And so you can have a really dense, small community that's excruciatingly wealthy due to the value of their ideas. And if Bitcoin mining solves the energy problem, which is most of what we need to survive, and then you can work online and spread your ideas, these startup cities don't necessarily need a government. Now, defense gets a little more complicated, but I can see this, right? If you squint hard enough, you can kind of see a sovereign individual thesis being aided by these mining hubs. Yeah. It's
just now, I think, landing with me how significant this is, because you're describing, so civilization will start to flow towards these areas. Well, initially it's Bitcoin mining being drawn toward these areas of cheaper energy, but then that's sort of bootstrapping an economy there. So then populations actually start to flow ultimately towards these areas of cheaper energy. As population growth increases in these areas, though, then so does the demand for energy. So the price of energy goes up, and then Bitcoin mining kind of flows off to the next cheapest place, right? So it really is going to cause us to spread out. I mean, especially I guess the other assumption behind all this is just the digital age itself. Like we can do most of our normal interactions remotely. So you don't the density of the city, urban density that was so useful in the 20th century is less relevant in this new world. And if you combine that with this force of Bitcoin mining, really an incentive structure, I guess, that's spreading out populations, that's really interesting. We end up covering the surface of the world to a much greater extent than we do currently with a city, hyper dense city urban model.
Exactly right.
Crazy.
And one point obviously analogies are not perfect, right? The map's not the territory. So in this case, all the miners won't leave, right? We go from a bootstrap city to a complex city. Most miners will leave, but there's always excess energy built into the grid.
Right.
Just a tangent that people always miss is we produce about 3 times as much energy as we consume. And some of that's because all energy is sort of siloed around the world. You have production and not necessarily enough consumers nearby. And also you have to prepare for the hottest day or the coldest day of the year. And so on May 10th, right, a perfect spring day, no one's heating their house, no one's cooling their house. In that situation, you're drawing only like 30% of what your capacity of energy is that day. But you need that capacity for January 15th when it's freezing and everybody's pumping their heat up. And so the point being, some miners will stay as an energy sponge to soak up all the excess.
That's a great point too. Just talking about how much the capacity, we build a capacity for the hottest or coldest day of the year, essentially. But then we live, by definition, we live way within the bounds of that capacity. And there's all this excess capacity worldwide. I know it's particularly acute here in North America. One of the executives we talked to at a publicly traded energy industry, company, said that the entire North American energy infrastructure was built for the hottest afternoon in August. So there's all this just unused capacity that can basically be used to mine Bitcoin.
Exactly. And that never goes away.
Yeah.
Right. And so what we'll see is Bitcoin miners flocking to the energy gluts. And then what I predict is there'll be some sort of equilibrium point where at this level of production, let's say in West Texas, we don't necessarily need the marginal miner. The marginal miner is going to be paying more and more and more for energy. So eventually you sort of hit a dynamic equilibrium there. And that sort of makes sense, right? Now, I don't see a future where that won't be the case just due to the laws of physics and how energy exists. And so unless some other type of consumer that is similar to Bitcoin's consumer profile, you could say, unless we see that come into the market, Bitcoin miners are going to be next to energy facilities forever. Right. And I don't want to say that with too much confidence because we probably will come up with other energy sources or energy demand.
Yeah.
But for now, Bitcoin's the main show.
Yeah. Well, yeah. To your point earlier, it's like it becomes energy buyer of first resort initially, but then it just kind of rolls down the heat to energy buyer of last resort, and that never goes away. Right. There's always going to be some flex capacity or excess capacity that will be sold to those buyers.
Exactly. And then one more frame here is there's new generation miners and there's old generation miners, right? The new gen miners are extremely efficient, but also capital intense. The old gen miners are not efficient at all, but they're extremely cheap. And so what you'll see is the new gen miners, they'll go in there and they'll monetize. They'll be the pioneer species because you have insane amounts of energy, and the new miners, they have to be running 24/7 more or less to make sense. Yeah. And so they'll go seed the energy investment, and then they'll leave and they'll actually go and start a new energy asset, new pioneer species situation. But then the old miners will come in, and those things, you keep them going as long as you possibly can, right? They'll monetize any excess energy you have at any price because there's no capital cost there.
No, that's interesting too, because even maybe depending on the hardware refresh cycle, it might be those new gen miners being the pioneer species. But by the time that economy gets bootstrapped, they're already older, So there's new going to pioneer the next locations.
Oh, that's true. They just retire in the place they started because of the depreciation cycle.
I'm sure there's a lot of wiggle room in there, right, where they're still moving around, but and if these ASICs are built with a long shelf life, you end up with Bitcoin mining probably being the biggest use of hardware, definitely the biggest use of energy worldwide, but probably the biggest hardware operation too.
Yeah, I wonder about that. There's some controversy, and it's not clear to me what the long-term game is. I think
Mhm.
what I think today is that it becomes a really boring business with small margins, similar to energy production today.
Mhm.
And if that's true, then we'll probably like peak in our energy usage in the next, I don't know, 30 years. And then maybe we'll actually decline after that as the subsidy is worth less and we
Yeah.
switch to fees. But it's too many unknowns to really be confident after that point.
Yeah. My conversation with Saylor, he described that he thought it would flip from being energy intensive to capital intensive, so that the energy bill would be a smaller component of the miner's operation going forward, be more about the hardware, right? Getting the latest and greatest hardware.
I see. So at that stage, yeah, a better machine, energy is abundant everywhere, or there's
Yeah.
enough energy at a low cost to satisfy the needs of the network. So at that point, you're only competing against which machine is more efficient.
Yeah. It's almost like a lot of the energy market arbitrage has been arbitraged away effectively. And then so you're now competing on hardware fundamentals, right? Like, I guess, dollars per hash or something to that effect.
I could see that.
Or whatever
Yeah,
the number one metric of ASICs is. I guess it's just hashes per, what is their, the term is escaping me. Well, the new
yeah,
generation
same.
has more blank than the old generation.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And what this thing that we were just talking about spreading out, I just call that the great spreading out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the interesting analogy is that humans used to be by rivers, right? River is transport, food, energy,
Yeah.
water to drink, defense, it's everything. Then we urbanized a bit more, industrial revolution. So that's the mega city.
Mm-hmm.
That's get people next to a factory to do a widget task. And then, okay, now we have the information economy. And I think that's obviously where we're going. That's probably dominant today, but we still haven't really adapted our location or how we live really. We're starting to see like the rise of the digital nomad. I think COVID accelerated Zoom meetings, work from home. You're seeing migration out of New York and California to like Texas, Florida, Arizona, et cetera. And so they say, well, why would I need to live next to my office? I don't need to pay San Francisco rent, right? So all those forces are already happening. And now you have, okay, the world seems to be going through a bit of some turmoil here. I don't really like the direction of our central planners. And so again, that's pushing people to explore alternative paths. And then you finally layer on the fact that Bitcoin mining enables this bootstrapping of new cities. And I think the most bullish case on this is actually small nuclear reactors, right? Gen 4 nuclear reactors. I don't think they're in any mass production scale, but they're in prototype phase. And what I've read is they're small enough to support about 200,000 people. That's really small. And so theoretically, we could put these things wherever we want and build these little startup cities. And then, okay, fine. Again, attracting ideological people, they're self-sufficient. We're going to see 1,000 experiments in government. And how do these new startup cities decide to set up a government? And how do they relate to their environment? And I think that experiment stage is the magic here, because we're not really making new governments, right? The land's kind of already owned, and there's not really any strong incentive to do so. And usually the uprisings get squashed. But Bitcoin, I think, enables the ability for startup cities not to get squashed. You can't steal their money, and they're probably going to be on average wealthy. And so there might be some way to like buy a chunk of land from an impoverished country and start over. If we have 1,000 of these, that's probably what it's going to take to figure out a new way for humans to exist that doesn't require mega nation states with mega armies to lead us. And so you can say you instead of you will own nothing and be happy, you will mine Bitcoin and be happy.
That's a great one. So yeah, I love this idea then that these Citadel seeds are driving entrepreneurial experimentation in governance itself, which is an area that's been sorely lacking that entrepreneurial impulse. And then presumably too, the ones that work best will just become emulated, right? That will become the new model. So this will be I don't know what you call it, nation state 2.0, networked states is something Balaji called it. Because whichever model of governance is creating the most economic output will just be forcibly adopted by others, or they'll be outcompeted, just like the case of energy producers not adding Bitcoin mining.
Exactly. It's just free market principles injected into governance.
Yes.
In a place where you could say, kind of in an abstract way, there's a monopoly on land today.
Yeah.
So there's a monopoly on these experiments. And I think to tie into Balaji's points, he thinks that these network, like land acquisition, pre-Gen 4 nuclear reactor, pre-colonization of these new areas, we're going to have network states or whatever, online communities essentially, who share values, they form hierarchies, they pool resources, and then you actually move physically.
Yeah.
And I think that makes the most sense, right? We just sort of atomize the state and then we relocate.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a network of these, right? To your point, we figure out the best model. And then instead of one, there's 20 that form a trade network. And membership in one city gives you membership in another city, or something like that.
Yeah. Be like the Soho House of Citadels or something.
Exactly. And I think it's fun to think about, but I also think it's, in a way, at least from my perspective, it's approaching existential. And what I mean by this is I think these citadels have a duty for our species, which is that it appears that the central planning apparatus, the mega state, is increasingly encroaching and trying to create some new form of state similar to China's social credit model. Like, we essentially automate government and all the function of it with software. And so then we can just use social credit scores to manage the population instead of old models. And if that's true, I don't really want to live in that world myself. And I know a lot of other people who don't. And it feels like that tide is moving fast. And so I guess what I see with these little citadels is I think that they actually need to preserve the spark of freedom. I think that is their actual duty here. It's to come up with a way that will eventually outcompete the Chinese social credit system. And I think without this model, like, I don't actually think Bitcoin money is good enough. I think it is the second and third order effects that are catalyzed from this disturbance. And so I think it's also practical, right? That's my ideology. I want that to be true. Other people may not, but I also think it's practical, right? People say, okay, China, very powerful. Are they going to outcompete the West and take over? Is their model superior? And I think that the answer is no, although it appears that they're encroaching on the West or whatever. The reality is, I think China is efficient. They steal innovation and they implement it with a ruthless efficiency. But I don't think China, or the Chinese model, to be more specific, is capable of producing the necessary innovation that humans need to thrive. And so I think innovation comes out of free places. And Matt Ridley, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book, I think it was called Innovation. And he essentially said that freedom is required to produce innovation. And innovation is required to produce prosperity.
Yes.
And so Bitcoin is actually upstream of freedom. Bitcoin enables an ecosystem to be free, enables individuals to pursue their own path in life, which leads to value. So Bitcoin enables freedom. Freedom enables innovation. Innovation enables prosperity. Yeah. So I think the whole thing is absolutely mandatory, practically and ideologically.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. So, in that formula, I guess you could call it, what is the role? I mean, the state serves no role in any of that, but you do need to defend these little economic networks. So, does this spreading out then? I mean, I guess we get experimentation in different models of defense too, right? People are just going to sign up for these startup cities and they're going to get some a la carte version of defense, I suppose, for whatever tax dollars they're paying. Does that, I mean, that seems very appealing, but then I guess after my conversation with Balaji, what I'm worried about in that situation is a giant centralized state like China, social credit score system with 1.5 billion people. Do they then become susceptible? These tiny microeconomies or citadels, are they then vulnerable or susceptible to giant centralized China or other megastate?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And I think in the short term, the answer is definitely yes. And I think the natural incentive for people looking to create startup cities will go in places where they feel their geography is relatively safe, right? Like I wouldn't build one of these in, one of the neighboring countries to China, but maybe I would in Latin America or something like that, which maybe has a little bit less influence. But I think it's a real thing to consider. And I think that the goal here, at least my optimistic view here, is that hot war becomes relatively archaic, I should say, and people don't really go there anymore. I think that's mostly true today. We're not going to see superpowers, I hope, blowing each other up, but we will see playing dirty in the economic games and trade networks and energy and natural resources hoarding and bottlenecks in the economy and China not giving us the things we need when we need them. I think that's more of the landscape that we're going to see war, right? As we move from a warlord into economics, into like after we have nuclear bombs economics.
Yeah.
And I hope that restrains us. And if so, then we may see like a Jason Lowery-esque hash war, right? Where economics become more important than your geography. So why would China take over a city state if they can't get any money? They can squash ideology, I guess, but they're not getting any Bitcoin.
Right. And they don't really get, like, even if they were coming to commandeer the energy source itself, that's presumably not a profitable enterprise to like go to war to then gain access to this energy source that you then have to compete in this low margin game of mining. So the carrot to warfare, even here, is still like way smaller than in the current world.
I think so.
Yeah.
If not, yeah, it's very hard for me to game that out, but that's at least that's the vectors that I see trending. And from this vantage point, that's enough for me to be optimistic. And with regards to nuclear bombs and, essentially asymmetric technology, I think that brings us to an interesting place as well, which is that we can't really redo the same mistakes. We can't repeat the same mistakes in history now that we have civilization or population ending tools, right? We're biologically designed to be competitive and to seek out more for ourselves and our kin. And that drives evolution, that drives economics. And that's okay, right? If we have a flint and rocks and fire, but if we have nuclear bombs and a high school kid can engineer a virus, then we can't really allow those things to occur anymore if we want to sustain long-term. And so trying to figure out a way to channel that competition into something that simulates war, I think that's necessary. Is it Bitcoin's proof of work? I hope so, maybe. If it's not, I think that's actually what we need, right? People always theorize what the great filter is. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's channeling our biological drive into a war-like simulation that doesn't have the same consequence.
Yeah, that's great. There's I just point the audience here. I've read a little bit about it, but it's excellent. It's the American pragmatist William James. I guess it's in the 1800s, maybe late 1800s. He's writing about this, that humanity needed a moral equivalent of war if we were ever to like go to the next level, because he just makes the point that war has been the most unifying force ever. Like you get two countries warring against one another, you've completely unified both populations, even though they're antagonistic to one another. So you need that unifying force, but ideally without all the violence, destruction, mayhem of war. So maybe this is that, that kind of gets into the Lowry thesis of, if we're going to have the future of warfare conducted by a bunch of drones, why not put all those drones on racks and just let them do something productive?
Exactly. Yeah, you're competitive, but by out hashing your neighbor, you're actually increasing the total hash power, right? And so you improve the whole network for everyone by acting in your own best interest. And I think that's the allegory of Bitcoin, right? It's channeling self-interest, which is innate to humans, and good luck getting rid of that, and channeling that into a positive externality in the world.
Yes.
And I think we're just starting to uncover these positive externalities as Bitcoin grows, as it bumps into more people, as it changes more of the environment around it, because Bitcoin's not changing, right? And so I think, to be honest, we don't know much about what this thing's going to do.
Yeah.
I think we're way further along than we were, let's say, in 2017. But I think it'd be arrogant, just like it's arrogant in biology, to assume we understand the world around us. I think the same is with Bitcoin. I think it's on a not quite the same order of magnitude, but Bitcoin interacts with something as complex as biology, right? So the second, third, fourth, nth order of effects are as complex as biology, thus hard to predict.
Yes. Yeah. And the thing that springs out of me here is I've hit this idea from a lot of different angles, but the idea of Bitcoin basically being a microcosm of capitalism itself. Or we could say, capitalism is basically economic Darwinism, right? It's just survival of the fittest. So this idea of having competition among humans, but within the bounds of private property, like warfare clearly just disgraces property, right? Destroys property, destroys people. It's awful. It's brutal. But if you can have this competition, an outlet for those same competitive energies in an arena where property is integral, I guess you could say, right? Like we're actually just competing with one another on a game of pure wealth accumulation versus wealth destruction. That it's in everyone's best interest, right? So I tweeted this the other day. I thought it was real witty. He said that Bitcoin's the best system in history we've yet devised for converting anyone's self-interest into everyone's self-interest. Like it actually aligns all of us towards, I guess, making things better versus just blowing each other up. Big mystery there.
Yeah, right. You just poetically said Bitcoin converts greed into freedom money, or Bitcoin creates incentives that lead to positive externalities.
Yeah.
That's the magic here, right? And coming back to complex systems, the central planning class wants to steer the ship. And they assume that by introducing a new policy, they're going to achieve a desired outcome, right? They assume order comes from policy. Order comes from you steering the ship and planning with smart guys in committees. Right. But the failing here is that order actually emerges from systems without any central planning. That's the fundamental error in the thinking. And if that was understood by central planners writ large, by Keynesian economists at large, I think we'd have a very different world today. And it comes back to humility, right? Yes. It's arrogant to assume we can understand the economy, just like biology. And so I don't know how to get that through to people, because they're very credentialed, and the more credentialed they are, the more arrogant they are about their position.
100%. And this fatal deceit of policy being the only mechanism to create order. I almost have a little sympathy for that thought process, because you're just sort of scaling it out, right? You're saying, oh, well, I as an individual, I make plans and then I go into the world and execute. And that's how I create order in my life. If I didn't do that, if I didn't plan, I would just be, well, I don't know, an animal, I guess, just rolling around. But you can't, that doesn't scale appropriately. You can't just have then the society that decides and makes plans for everyone else. It's like the responsibility needs to rest with the individual actor, right? Otherwise, you're breaking feedback loops or breaking their skin in the game to the point where you create negative externalities, which is the opposite of what Bitcoin is doing.
Yes, exactly. And the quote that comes to mind for me always is the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? I think in Bitcoin land, we very quickly demonize central banks and we demonize state actors, et cetera. And I think by and large that they are acting out with good intentions. They believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're capable and they're trying. Yeah, they have their own pathologies mixed in there, but by and large, good intentions. And unfortunately, good intentions that produce poor outcomes. As far as I'm concerned, your good intentions do not matter. You're acting evil and you're acting evil due to ignorance, and that's your fault. Yeah. And so, yeah, like Hayek had a quote, which frames this up nice, which is, we don't have an issue with problems. We have an issue with solutions, right? We're just over-engineering everything. And Huxley, same deal. He actually, this is a book you should read if you haven't. Huxley obviously wrote Brave New World. And about 10 or 20 years later, he wrote Brave New World Revisited. This is a retrospective of his dystopia. And in the delta between the two books, 1984 was written, right? So he contrasts the two dystopian ways to control the world. And he also looks at encroaching centralization, the risk of all these things. And he essentially warns us, it feels like it was written today. He's warning us of the same things we're experiencing today. And he had this framing that stuck with me, which is that the central planners, they view humans as insects, right? It's just parts to a whole, right? Not as autonomous. They're all just like bees. But the reality is that humans are more like wolves in a wolf pack. We cooperate because it's in our best interest. And one wolf is going to get destroyed by a pack of wolves. So we form packs of wolves. And that pack of wolf could be a kin group, a city state, a country, a religion, right? We that's how we operate. We are not autonomous drones, and you can't manage us that way, which is kind of what the data model of economics reduces down to.
Yeah, it's so obvious. I don't know if you just evaluate your presuppositions, like what human have you ever met that's an automaton? I mean, they don't exist, right? If you try to push someone to do anything, you're almost inevitably going to create some unintended consequence. They're going to do something unpredictable. So like, if you can't do that with one person, what type of deceit and arrogance are you perpetrating to think that you can do that on everyone or most people? Yeah, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, it really does. Let me pitch you a couple more predictions on the mining synthesis before I know we're going to run out of time here soon. So the first one is the great spreading out. We kind of covered that. That sovereign individual thesis meets Bitcoin mining, meets network state, meets back to the land homesteading, but high tech and with cryptography, right? And self-sovereignty based. The next one is that Bitcoin mining leads to energy abundance. We touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but it's essentially now that there is a price for energy anywhere in the world that never existed before, that incentivizes people to figure out how to capture new forms of energy in new places with more efficiency, because efficiency equals profit. Right. So it teaches us how to be better with our existing tools and also to create new tools to harness energy. And similar to how demand for, back to the internet, right? Once streaming became popular, people wanted streaming, obviously a good product. However, the internet was so crappy at the time that you really couldn't do it, right? Netflix started by mailing us CDs because streaming wasn't ready. Now we have a demand for streaming, which led to an increased investment in internet infrastructure, right? So the demand for energy caused by Bitcoin is going to lead to an increase in supply of Bitcoin because we're going to invest more into it. And so that over a long enough time frame is essentially the discipline humans need, or the incentive humans need to be better at energy. And back to the beginning, energy is upstream of all the good things. Right. And so that's going to be massive. And as our energy constraints decline, right, there's our H2O desalination plants, increased food, space travel, terraform Mars, all kinds of futuristic stuff. We essentially get rid of all poverty, and we raise the standard of living up to some sort of an acceptable average, right? Energy can do that. And above and beyond a family, a chance out in the world, basic needs met, that's a good goal. I don't think there's much more to reach for there.
Yeah, well said. And maybe a admittedly simplistic way I've thought about this, it's like when you look at history, whatever humans monetize, they just produce more of, because there's a huge incentive to create money, obviously. We monetize gold. Well, today gold has a $10 trillion market cap. 8 trillion of that, give or take, is monetary demand for gold. It's gold that would not have been produced if gold was not money, right? So we literally pull gold out of the ground to go and stick it in a vault somewhere else in the ground. Like, that's the monetary demand for gold. So you could say if 2 trillion is industrial use, 8 trillion of gold's market cap is monetary use, then by monetizing gold, we've effectively produced 5x more gold than we otherwise would have. Okay. Then you look at something like fiat currency, which is effectively monetized debt. What's happened with debt? Well, we've produced a shitload of it. We have 350% global debt to GDP. And so when you evaluate Bitcoin through that lens, it's like, okay, now we're monetizing energy, this primary input to all economic processes, which means we're going to produce a lot more of it. And if you produce a lot more of something, you tend to find ways to do it cheaper, better, faster. So, it's just a really big deal.
It is a big deal. And kind of a funny connection point here is that you're right? Whatever we value increases in supply because we figured out how to make it. Except for, or I guess because of that, that's why we need to be really specific about what we choose as our money. Right? The hardness of producing the money, or Szabo's unforgeable costliness.
Yes.
Which essentially means it's expensive to make. And once you make it, it's very cheap to verify that what you made actually is what you said it is. Right? Those two tension points are what allow us to use commodity money as gold, or I guess why we chose gold, due to unforgeable costliness. And Bitcoin takes that same idea and obviously makes it the single hardest commodity to produce. Thermodynamically verifiable that it was produced. Right? If glass beads were money, we know how that story ends. You're going to go manufacture glass beads. You wrote a nice essay about that.
It makes all the sense in the world once you understand what's going on here. Like, you need to understand money, how it evolves, and you need to understand the importance of energy. But Bitcoin is just really, it's combined these things in such a mind-blowing tool that none of us, despite our hundreds of hours of talking about it, have managed to get our head around it.
Exactly. That's the allure, at least in my perspective, right? If I master something or close to master something, I sort of lose interest, right? As soon as I hit diminishing returns, I'm on to something else. Whereas Bitcoin seems to actually, it's like my reading list. The more I read, the longer my reading list gets. The more countries I travel to, the more I learn about new countries and cities, that my travel list gets longer as well. I think Bitcoin's the same, right? It fractals into all these other disciplines because money is not just on an island, right? It touches everything. And Bitcoin has embedded political ideology, right? It's not political, but it has embedded politics, and that those are attractive to me, right? And I think they're also good for humans. It's wild stuff.
Yeah, that is a heck of a ride, that's for sure. All right, well, let's put a button on it here, and then we'll have you back to further this discussion. Just in case my audience doesn't know, where can they find out more about you or your work?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thanks for having me. Really, really appreciate the chat as always. The best place is Twitter. That's where I'm testing ideas, shooting from the hip, and also produce some threads every now and then. The handle is bquittem, BQUITTEM. I publish all my writing at brandonquittem.com, my name. And then this recent essay is only on Medium for now. I published it under the Bitcoin Times, which is Alex Svedsky's curated publication. So just go to my Twitter. It's the pinned tweet. You'll see a thread summarizing a lot of the material we covered and a link to that essay, which goes a lot deeper and broader than we covered today.
Awesome. Brandon, this has been a blast, and I'll see you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Robert.
Hey guys, I hope you found this episode valuable. At the What is Money Show, we are striving to deliver the most valuable knowledge possible in each and every episode. However, as Aristotle said, the purpose of knowledge is action, not knowledge. So I hope you're deriving some useful knowledge from the show, and I hope it's improving the actions you are taking in your life. Speaking of action, if you want to dive deeper into the big ideas explored in this show, please sign up for my newsletter titled The Freedom Analects at breedlove22.substack.com. Also, have you bought your tickets for Bitcoin 2022 in Miami yet? If not, it's your lucky day, as I am giving away 10 million sats, which is roughly 4,000 US dollars, to one lucky person who buys a conference ticket through my affiliate link. My affiliate link can be found on my Twitter profile at breedlove22, which also has a link. My Twitter profile has a link to my link tree, which you can also visit my link tree directly for links to all my work, including Bitcoin 2022 affiliate cells. My link tree is linktr.ee/breedlove22. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys watching the show. I hope you're finding some valuable knowledge in the What is Money Show, and I'll see you back here again next time.